Hello, class. Welcome back. So I want to talk about these sort of three main routes in a little bit more detail that Korean men have to performing masculinity. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the last video, but the first one is going to be patriarchal authority. So this comes from this old Confucian idea of patriarchy, that the man of the house is the point of the house, the position of authority, and everybody else is below them. The ideas and practices that define men as the principal income earners of the family validates domestic authority. So this Korean authority, which comes from patriarchy, which comes from Confucianism, which places man over wife, older brother over younger brother, etc. If you study Confucianism very much, has been adapted to modern day by being principal income earner. So it validates domestic authority and dominance in South Korea so that men's earning power becomes a primary indicator of their manliness, not unlike the United States, but there are some differences. Now, the second one is called Sunbi masculinity, and I don't think we really have something called Sunbi masculinity. This one is pretty different than what we are used to. So Sunbi is a Confucian scholar masculinity from the Chosun dynasty, and I know you don't know very much about, or you probably don't know. I don't know if maybe you do know about South Korea and Korean history, but during the Chosun dynasty, people who were yangban, people who were elites, would send their sons to be a Confucian scholar, and they would just study all day, and it was considered derogatory or degrading if they were to perform manual labor. They're so smart and they're so well bred that their job is to just study all of the time. And so it's sometimes called soft masculinity. And so they have access to this type of masculinity. In the modern day performance of this, you can see pretty readily in K-pop groups that spend all of their time studying culture, studying dance, studying music, studying things that Confucian scholars also would have studied, this sort of classical education in some ways. And so they wear makeup, they wear clothing that we would consider very feminine. They have relatively slim bodies that we don't consider necessarily to be masculine. And so this is called Sunbi masculinity. And for South Koreans, this is actually considered very masculine. It is a type of masculinity that South Koreans have access to that I don't think works in quite the same way in the United States. Some of the greatest sex symbols for men in Korea are Sunbi men that are things like BTS and other K-pop groups. Now, another kind of masculinity comes from violence, just like in the United States, but this violence is shaped very differently. It is the product of Korean men having to have mandatory military service. It is the product of Korean peninsula being ripped into two after 1945 and being transformed against their will into North Korea and South Korea. So mandatory military service subjects men to extreme physical hardship and discipline within a strict hierarchical system. Because of these ideas about Confucianism and patriarchy, these younger men are thrust into this very hierarchical system where older men within the military have absolute control over their bodies. So what you see here is a man that probably did something very small, did a minor infraction, didn't scrub his shoes right or something, and he's being forced to hold this pose with his head and his feet holding him up on this sort of bench for probably a long time. And I didn't experience this, but as a teacher, I used to teach kindergarten students, and some of the other Korean kindergarten teachers would force students to not do exactly this, but they would force them to do similar positions if they were to talk during class or to act out. They would force them to do these really uncomfortable poses for long periods of time. Now, technically that's illegal now, but I still saw it all of the time in 2014, 2015. I haven't been in a kindergarten class for a long time, so I don't know if it's still happening, but I imagine it probably does, particularly in the countryside. So several kinds of abuse, including cases that have led to suicide or murder, are reported every year from the Korean military. And again, everybody must join the military. Violence at South Korean masculinity is constructed due to Korea's political condition of national division and history of authoritarian dictators and militarism. But it's also the time, this is the time when most South Korean men end up sleeping with sex workers for the very first time. And because of the combination of military service, this violent masculinity of military service combined with Korean masculinity of patriarchal authority, that is income-driven masculinity, many South Korean men do not consider sleeping with the sex worker to be cheating on their wives. They consider it to be they're exercising their patriarchal authority, their ability to be a breadwinner, to spend their money how they want to, and to spend it on this outside resource of sex. And it's not the same as the American access to masculinity of, oh, I can sleep with lots and lots of women, therefore I am masculine. I am sexually attractive to women, therefore I'm masculine. No, it is I have the buying power to be able to afford to buy sex workers, and they don't interfere with my romantic relationships. They are just for sex, they're throwaway. And so that increases my masculinity because of military service combined with patriarchal authority, with their breadwinner masculinity. So there's some similarities, but also some really key differences in why men are attracted to having sex with sex workers and why that's such a dominant business in South Korea today. And you'll notice that some of these masculinities are quite contradictory. Violence and patriarchal authority combined with flower boy, soft sunbi masculinity, they're quite different. In a way that I don't think our access to masculinity quite is. And I don't have a lot to say about this because it just strikes me, and I haven't thought about it much, but I think it's interesting to point out. So I'm going to skip through some of this and just point out that masculinity in South Korea is changing. This man on the in both of these images, his name is Rain. He started out as a K-pop star that ended up being a solo artist called Rain, and he became incredibly unpopular. But you see him here on the far left. This is actually a men's magazine by Time. Rain was selected by Time magazine as one of the world's most influential 100 people in 2006. And the reason for that was he was redefining masculinity. Now, I don't know if he was redefining masculinity in South Korea. You can see he's pretty bulky compared to the soft masculine characters like we've seen here. He's pretty bulky and, you know, I was going to skip this slide, but I guess I'll say this character on the right was a main character in a South Korean drama in the 1990s, and he was considered very masculine, but very much more like a flower boy, a sunbi soft masculine character. I don't know if Rain was really redefining masculinity in South Korea. He fits into South Korean masculinity just fine. I think he was redefining South Asian masculinity in the United States and what our expectations for what an Asian male body might look like. Like, yes, we can also be masculine in a Western European type way through bulking up and these kinds of things. So a real quick question for you, and I'll end this discussion of masculinity, extramarital sexuality, and economics, frankly, by asking, are biological men more likely to engage in extramarital affairs due to some sort of innate biological predisposition, or does it have more to do with culture? Is there just something about biological men and our sex drive and we can't control ourselves and therefore we sleep around more, as some biologists and some, frankly, biological anthropologists might argue? Or is it due, you know, maybe that is true or maybe that's not true, but it depends much more heavily on what culture you are raised in. If having sex with multiple people or extramarital people has to do with masculinity or has to do with other advantages, maybe it has more to do with culture. What do you think? Where do you come down in this argument? Why or why not? Are biological women less likely to cheat because of culture or biology? Maybe we can table that question for now because we haven't been talking about biological women up until this point. But think about that other question. Is it culture or is it biology?